History is rarely as simple as we are taught to believe. We grow up thinking it is a clear record of facts, dates, and events carefully preserved from the past. But the deeper you look, the more uncomfortable the picture becomes. Because history is not just a collection of what happened. It is also a selection of what was allowed to be remembered. Every empire that rose, every war that was fought, and every hero that was celebrated passed through the filter of power before reaching the pages we read. And power rarely preserves the full story. Sometimes libraries burned and the world called it an accident. Sometimes entire peoples disappeared and the record went quiet. Sometimes decisions that changed millions of lives were reduced to a single clean sentence in a textbook. What we inherit as history often feels complete, ordered, and logical. But real human events are messy, contradictory, and deeply political. This raises an unsettling question. How much of the past are we truly seeing? And how much are we only being shown? Across centuries, rulers, states, and even well-meaning societies have shaped the narrative in ways that favored stability, authority, or collective comfort. Uncomfortable truths were softened, complicated figures were simplified, and inconvenient voices were pushed into silence. Not always through grand conspiracies, but often through small, repeated choices about what was worth preserving and what was easier to forget. The result is a version of the past that feels solid on the surface while hiding deep fractures underneath. In this video, we are not chasing myths for the sake of mystery. We are examining the quiet patterns behind the official story, the moments where reality was smoothed over, the details that did not fit the preferred narrative, and the questions that were never fully answered. These are not always secrets locked in darkness. Sometimes they are truths that sat in plain sight but were rarely connected or seriously questioned. So before we begin, consider this carefully. If history is written by the powerful and remembered by the comfortable, then what happens to the parts that serve neither? Today, we pull back the curtain and look at 10 hidden truths of history that challenge the story we thought we knew. Fact 1. Throughout history, knowledge has always been power, and wherever knowledge gathers, power eventually notices. We are often told that the great libraries of the ancient world were tragic accidents of time, unfortunate casualties of war, fire, or chaos. But the deeper historians look, the less accidental some of these losses appear. Consider the great centers of learning, vast collections of scrolls, scientific observations, philosophical works, and cultural memory, all concentrated in a single place. These were not just buildings filled with books. They were reservoirs of independent thought, and independent thought has never been entirely comfortable for those who rule. When a library burns, something more than paper disappears. Generations of memory vanish, competing ideas fall silent, alternative futures quietly close. In several historical cases, the destruction of major knowledge centers followed moments of political tension, religious consolidation, or imperial transition, moments when controlling the narrative became unusually valuable. This does not always mean there was a single mastermind behind every fire. History is rarely that simple, but it does raise a disturbing pattern. Again and again, when power restructures itself, large bodies of knowledge tend to suffer. Was every great library lost purely by accident, or were some losses quietly convenient for the new order taking shape? We may never recover everything that was burned, but the pattern it left behind is still visible, a reminder that the struggle over knowledge has always been a struggle over power. Fact 2. History, written by the victors. If knowledge is power, then narrative is control. We often imagine history as a neutral record, an objective memory carefully preserved across generations. But history has rarely been neutral. Most of what survives from the past passed through the hands of the winners. Empires documented their triumphs. Kings commissioned their own glory. Chroniclers often depended on the very powers they were describing, and slowly, almost invisibly, the story of the past began to tilt. When one side wins a war, it does not only gain land or wealth, it gains the right to explain what the war meant. Defeats become necessary sacrifices. Conquests become civilizing missions, and resistance is often rewritten as rebellion or chaos. This does not always happen through deliberate lies. More often it happens through omission. Some voices are recorded in detail, others fade into fragments, or disappear entirely. The result is a version of history that feels complete on the surface, while remaining deeply selective underneath. This raises a quiet but uncomfortable question. How different would our understanding of the past be if the defeated had written the textbooks? Across centuries, entire civilizations, leaders and movements have been remembered primarily through the words of those who overcame them. Not because their enemies had no story to tell, but because their records did not survive or were never preserved with equal care. The pattern appears again and again. The louder the victory, the quieter the opposing memory. Today, we inherit a past that often feels clear and settled. But clarity can sometimes be the product of imbalance. And when we read history, we are not only reading what was remembered, we are also standing in the shadow of what was allowed to disappear. Fact 3. The forgotten women geniuses. History often presents genius as if it followed a very narrow path. Most of the names we repeatedly hear, scientists, philosophers, artists, innovators, fit a familiar pattern. But the deeper researchers look into the past, the more incomplete that picture begins to feel. Because across many centuries, brilliant women were not always absent from history. They were frequently minimized, overshadowed, or quietly pushed to the margins. In some cases, their work survived, but their recognition did not. In others, their contributions were attributed to male relatives, students, or contemporaries. And sometimes, the historical record simply grew thin around them. Not because they lacked influence, but because preservation itself was selective. Social structures in many periods restricted women's access to formal education, institutions, and authorship. This meant that even exceptional talent often had to operate in narrower spaces, private courts, informal networks, or under patronage that did not always record their names with equal weight. But traces remain. When we look carefully, we find women producing sophisticated scientific observations, philosophical writings, medical knowledge, and remarkable works of art, often under conditions far more constrained than their male counterparts. The pattern is subtle but persistent. Absence in the textbook does not always mean absence in reality. Today, as historians revisit archives and reassess older assumptions, more of these figures are slowly returning to view, not as anomalies, but as evidence that the intellectual past was always more diverse than the traditional narrative suggested. The hidden truth is not that women lacked genius. The hidden truth is how often that genius was filtered, framed, or quietly set aside by the systems that recorded history. Fact 4. Forbidden books and dangerous knowledge. Not all knowledge disappears in flames. Sometimes it is quietly locked away, restricted, or declared too dangerous for ordinary people to access. Throughout history, societies have repeatedly drawn invisible lines around certain ideas, labeling some texts heretical, subversive, or socially destabilizing. Once a work crosses that line, it rarely vanishes overnight. Instead, it begins a slower and often more effective form of disappearance. Limited copying, restricted circulation, and social stigma attached to those who read or preserve it. This process does not always require dramatic censorship. Sometimes it operates through institutions, sometimes through religious authority, sometimes through political pressure, and sometimes through the simple fear of association. When knowledge becomes risky to possess, fewer people are willing to protect it. Over time, the effect compounds. Manuscripts are copied less frequently. Discussions around them grow quieter. New generations encounter only fragments, or nothing at all. What survives then begins to shape what future societies believe was important to know. History shows repeated moments when entire categories of thought, scientific, philosophical, or theological, moved in and out of acceptability depending on who held authority at the time. This does not mean every restriction was part of a grand coordinated plan. Human systems are rarely that perfectly controlled, but the pattern remains striking. Ideas that challenge dominant structures often face the highest barriers to survival. The hidden truth is not simply that some books were banned. It is that controlling the boundaries of acceptable knowledge has long been one of the most subtle and powerful tools of influence. When we look back at the past, we are not only seeing what humanity discovered, we are also seeing what it was allowed to keep. Fact 5. The invention of the normal person. The idea of a normal person feels natural to us today. It feels obvious, neutral, almost scientific. But for most of human history, this concept did not exist in the way we understand it now. What societies considered acceptable behavior changed constantly across time and place. Yet at certain moments in history, states, institutions, and cultural authorities began to define more rigid standards of what counted as proper, healthy, or socially acceptable. At first, this process often emerged from practical needs, administration, law, public order, but over time it evolved into something more powerful. Classifications multiplied, people were measured, ranked, and compared against constructed averages, and slowly the word normal began to carry moral weight. To be normal meant to be safe, to be predictable, to be easier to integrate into the system. But anyone outside that narrowing definition risked being labeled unstable, irrational, or dangerous. This did not always happen through open oppression. More often it worked through social pressure, education systems, and cultural expectations. The most effective systems rarely force conformity directly. They make deviation feel uncomfortable enough that people begin adjusting themselves voluntarily. History shows that once a society strongly defines normality, it gains a subtle but far-reaching form of control. Because people do not only fear punishment, they fear exclusion. The hidden truth is that normal has never been purely descriptive. It has often been quietly prescriptive, a moving boundary shaped by the needs of the time and the priorities of those with influence. When we look back, we may discover that what felt natural and inevitable in one era was, in fact, carefully constructed in another. Fact 6. The hidden causes of wars. Wars are rarely as simple as they are later described. In textbooks, conflicts often appear to begin with a single event, a political dispute, an assassination, a sudden act of aggression. But real wars almost never emerge from one moment alone. They build slowly, layer by layer, through pressures that remain mostly invisible to the public eye. Economic competition, control of trade routes, resource scarcity, and shifting power balances often create the deeper currents long before the first soldier moves. Yet these structural tensions are complex and difficult to communicate, so history frequently compresses them into cleaner, more emotionally satisfying explanations. A single spark is easier to remember than a decade of mounting pressure, but this simplification can hide how calculated many conflicts actually were. Decisions for war have often been made in rooms far removed from the battlefield, by leaders weighing costs, risks, and strategic advantage. Sometimes populations were prepared gradually through rhetoric and fear. Sometimes alliances locked nations into paths that became increasingly difficult to escape. And sometimes leaders believed the window for action was closing and chose to strike before their position weakened. None of this means every war was secretly orchestrated from the shadows. History is shaped by miscalculation as often as by intent. But a clear pattern appears again and again. By the time the public sees the crisis, the deeper machinery has usually been moving for years. The hidden truth is that wars rarely begin where the story usually starts. They begin earlier, quieter, and far more strategically than most people ever realize. Fact 7. The myth of natural empire. Collapse empires are often said to fall naturally, as if decline were simply the fate of all large powers. But history rarely supports such clean explanations. Most collapses followed years of internal strain, corruption, overextension, economic imbalance, and delayed reform. The language of inevitability can be comforting. It removes responsibility from human decisions. But when we look closely, many imperial declines were not sudden acts of fate. They were slow failures to adapt. The hidden truth is that what looks natural in hindsight was often preventable in real time. Fact 8. The power of symbols over people. Throughout history, symbols have often moved societies more effectively than facts. Flags, crowns, religious icons, and national myths condensed complex realities into emotionally powerful images. People do not always mobilize because of detailed arguments. They mobilize because symbols make abstract ideas feel personal and urgent. Leaders across centuries understood this well. Control the symbol and you often guide the crowd. The hidden truth is that large human movements are rarely driven by information alone. They are driven by meaning. Fact 9. The illusion of historical accidents. Many turning points in history are described as accidents, unexpected moments that changed everything. But when historians retrace the timeline, these moments often sit on top of long chains of prior decisions. Logistical failures, miscommunication, overconfidence, and delayed responses frequently set the stage long before the visible accident occurs. True randomness does exist in history, but far less often than popular narratives suggest. The hidden truth is that many so-called accidents were systems already under pressure, finally reaching their breaking point. Fact 10. The silence of the majority. Perhaps the most consistent hidden pattern in history is not the power of the few, but the silence of the many. Across different eras and cultures, major shifts often occurred not simply because leaders acted, but because large populations hesitated, adapted, or chose stability over resistance. This silence is rarely born from ignorance alone. It grows from fear, uncertainty, exhaustion, and the human desire to avoid risk. The hidden truth is that history is shaped not only by those who move first, but also by those who wait too long.